Bridger Fates, and welcome to Master Stockman Consulting's supplemental videos on ag research. You know, one of the biggest challenges for ag producers is understanding how, if, or when to implement ag research. We have 5 videos with 5 different research projects from right here in Utah. We'll describe the projects to you, and then we're going to work through the principles that you've learned in the Business Power Tools for Ag videos to be able to analyze these research projects to understand if, when, and how you should implement them. These videos are sponsored and funded through Western SARE, and we appreciate them for their funding. Now here's Barton Stam to talk to us about the next research project.
The project I've chosen to talk about today is Medusahead control and revegetation in southern Cache County. Medusahead is an invasive annual grass. Another invasive annual grass that you might have heard of is cheatgrass. I'm standing in a small patch of cheatgrass today. One of the problems with invasive annual grasses is they outcompete perennial grasses that are more desirable for livestock production. You might have heard that cheatgrass is a bad invasive annual grass. It's much more preferable than Medusahead. Unlike Medusahead, cheatgrass is actually palatable to livestock for a short time each year. But because of a high silica content in Medusahead, it's almost never palatable for wildlife and can drastically reduce the value of our rangelands. This project had several objectives. The first objective was to gauge the effectiveness of a couple different herbicides on control of Medusahead. The herbicides we looked at were Oust and Plateau. These herbicides are pre-emergent herbicides that prevent plants from germinating from seed and growing. The second objective was to look at revegetation techniques of desirable perennial grasses. The authors of this study also wanted to look at revegetation techniques on terrain that was difficult to farm. So for instance, looking at revegetating rocky, steep slopes. Finally, the authors wanted to figure out if they could establish forage kochia on some of these sites. Forage kochia is a perennial plant that is much more desirable for grazing lands. Now, because of the deep thatch layer that Medusahead forms, which makes germination from desirable species incredibly difficult, the authors of this study also chose to do some prescribed burning on sites that were heavily infested by Medusahead. And actually, the county fire department helped them out with this. So some of the results that they found was that Oust was effective in controlling Medusahead for a time, but it did require that they wait 12 to 18 months before they could revegetate with desirable perennial grasses. The rates at which they used the Plateau herbicide were not that effective in controlling the Medusahead. The authors also ran into some trouble with some of the weather conditions during this study. Because of drought during the years, quite a few of the revegetation sites with perennial vegetation failed. Some of the contributors of this study had some very interesting techniques for revegetating steep, rocky hillsides. For instance, one of the landowners in this study used sheep to trample in seed of perennial grasses into areas that were steep and rocky where they were unable to use traditional farming techniques. The forage kochia seedings in this study were a failure, with very few seedlings ever recorded. One of the big successes of this study, though, was to create more landowner awareness about the problem with Medusahead. In fact, the authors of this study were able to have field days where interested landowners and other parties were able to attend and visit the sites where control of Medusahead and the revegetation techniques were conducted. Now, fortunately, most of you probably won't have to deal with Medusahead. Medusahead is a significant invasive weed problem that has many unique challenges. But most of you, during your land management opportunities, probably will be faced with some invasive weed situations. So, the management techniques that were used in this study may not be specifically applicable for all of you, but using some of their creative ideas to manage the weeds for their unique situations will be a useful tool for you to use while you battle your own invasive weed problems. Now we're going to go to a roundtable discussion where we discuss some more details of this project in depth with the team.
That was a great summary of this project. Now we want to talk about how this project will relate to some of the other tools and concepts that we've talked about in the other videos. So Barton, you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, this project looking at an invasive species like Medusahead and how we can replace it with something more useful. You know, Brian, whenever we're talking about replacing one plant species with another or a mix of other species, there's some risk, there's some problems with that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if we think about this in the context of getting started in an ag operation, maybe you are, working with this piece of land where we have this invasive plant, you're kind of limited on what options you have, but, there are some tools that are available, but, you may go out and, do some reseeding or some spraying of herbicides and different things, but we have to keep in mind that it's not going to work 100% of the time, right? There's things with the weather, other things that may happen as far as things in the environment where it just doesn't work out the way we plan. So we have to be thinking ahead that, hey, even though this is a perfect world that we're thinking about this to work in, it may not happen that way. So keeping that in mind is really important, especially when, we're thinking about getting started into something. So.
Yeah, when we're working in the real world, there's definitely risks, especially when we're talking about non-irrigated rangelands. And speaking about these rangelands, if we have a pasture that's infested with a species like Medusahead, there's just not a lot of value for an ag producer there.
Yeah, exactly. Economically, we're thinking the payoff of rangeland improvement in this situation. So, if you have the Medusahead grass infecting, certain areas of pasture or maybe the whole pasture, it's basically unusable at that point. So you're not gaining any benefit from it. So if you can find effective methods to eliminate that or replace it with something that is usable, that could be a big payoff and could reduce a lot of your costs.
For sure. So looking at those tools we have to maybe increase the value both biologically and for sure economically is going to be real important to a producer. Bridger, are there some tools we can look at to see how we could gauge the effectiveness of some of these treatments?
Yeah, actually, so one of the tools that you might think about is net present value tool, and really I've designed a specific tool under that net present value. If you go to the calculator on the Wyoming Ranch Tools site and click on the EconoRange tab, it's really a specialized net present value that's designed to help you understand how these range and pasture improvement projects might work in terms of economically. And so, it goes through and it accounts for risk through the discount rate. So, as Brian said, these can be kind of risky. And so we account for some of that. We account for the investment of going through the process of either reseeding or treating the invasive weed. And then we think about how much that forage is worth on an animal unit basis. And then finally, the model accounts for the improvement in the number of animals that we can graze on that property. So those are all key elements that go into that decision, but it really helps you on any of these sorts of range and pasture improvements like this project make good decisions as to whether that might make sense economically.
I really like that those tools have the ability to measure risk because, risk came out in this project for sure because the people involved in this project were dealing with drought, which is something that we see a lot of in the West, but it really came to light in this project with the risk and in this project, the failure of the desired species to become established because of drought, which is a risk that we all face, especially in the Intermountain West.
Hudson, how are keeping records going to be important with a project like this?
I specifically like this project because it emphasizes a couple of things that I've talked throughout the videos and throughout the information. And the first one being, in agriculture, it's really, we get in these unique positions where we have to mix financial records with production records. And this really emphasizes that. Look at the stated objectives in this project. They wanted to look at 2 different herbicides, different application rates, different spray rates, different costs, right? And then, what does that do to our production? They wanted to use, I think, 3 different species, 2 different grass species, and then a forage kochia. How much does that cost? How do we have to seed it? All of that goes into it. And then what is our production? We're mixing those records. The third thing is they wanted to look at it, I think, in some on some hills and some harder places. So boy, they've got a lot going on in this project, and it really emphasizes how unique it is for ag producers to constantly try to look at their financial records and how to merge those with their production records to make decisions. And the other thing is, trend analysis. This is not something we want to get rid of from 1 year. We'll have to keep records on productions in those pastures. Is the grass coming back? Which herbicide worked best for us to use in the future, and that kind of stuff. So I think I really like that project because it emphasizes some of the things that's so important and really the hardest thing about record keeping for producers.
This was another project where I really appreciate how they went through the scientific process of stating their several objectives, going through how they conducted the experiment, analyzing the results, and then they actually had field days to present the results to the community and to raise awareness of this problem. So there was benefits not only to the landowners and to the researchers, but to the community at large, increasing awareness of this invasive species release.
Hopefully you found this discussion helpful as we tied the project to the other tools and concepts that we've already talked about, and hopefully you'll watch the rest of the videos in this series.